Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History Right podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Nicholas Allen. Nicholas Peter Lee Allen is currently a professor in the School of Ancient Languages and Text Studies of Northwest University, South Africa. A confirmed transdisciplinarian, he is the author and co-author of 6 books and a score of accredited articles on topics including apocryphal literature, Sindonology, and early Christian church history, specializing in Josephus Flavius. He was also the editor-in-chief of the South Africa Journal of Art History from 1997 to 2006. And today's interview is based upon Professor Allen's book, Christian Forgery and Jewish Antiquities, Josephus Interrupted. The link to purchase the book is in the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below. That being said, welcome to the History Valley podcast, Professor Allen. And just before I continue, is my audio coming in good for you, Nicholas?
Okay, great.
Oh,
Hi.
So I want to start off with, can you tell us a bit about the Christian dependence on Josephus regarding 3 passages in question, the Jesus, John, and James passages, and why were they added into Josephus?
Okay, well, a bit of general background information, a lot of people don't know this, is that when Christianity started off, traditionally we want to believe it started about 30, 40 years after the death of Jesus on the crucifixion, which is supposed to have happened around about 33 CE, or in other words, of the Common Era. But the Christology and the myth and the dogma of the religion didn't really start to gain traction until the 2nd and early 3rd century of the Common Era. And if one reads, for example, the gospel accounts, one will actually see how the theology is evolving and changing in those early centuries. In fact, to the point where there are even moments of embarrassment in the Gospels because things are being stated which don't gel with later theological interpretations, which is another topic I know, but it's important because the early Christians didn't question the validity of the information that they had. But when you get to the late 2nd, early 3rd, and later the 4th century, the first church fathers, people like Eusebius, Origenus, Africanus, all these great Christian authorities, they started to get a lot of, shall we say, literature which was contradicting their statements. One most famous being Celsus, who claimed that everything was pure myth and wasn't valid. So people like Origenus started to challenge him and said, well, what we believe is true and historically valid, and they started to look for historical information to back up what was in the Bible, or the New Testament, and very quickly found that there wasn't anything. And so we have a situation where a lot of documents came to light which supposedly support extra biblical accounts of Jesus. But as we now know, they can all be disproven for various reasons, and we can discuss that later. But in desperation, people like Eusebius even started to make statements that you could lie to somebody to convert them because you're going to save their soul, which is an admission of being quite devious. You can make stuff up if it's going to be for a good purpose, and we call this pious fraud. And pious fraud was very popular by the 3rd and 4th centuries, and what I am claiming, and a lot of other authors are claiming now, is that Josephus' texts, which the last one was written just before the end of the 1st century, were used as very useful tools to interpolate and include information that would support that there was, in fact, an historical Jesus mentioned outside of the New Testament. That, in a nutshell, is what happened. And Josephus, in the first, so we say, 1,000 years of the Common Era, became very popular because it was treated automatically as being a valid historical document. In the 1600s, there were some scholars who looked at it afresh and realized that these comments made by Josephus, supposedly confirming the existence of Jesus and John the Baptist and James the Just, looked very suspicious. And indeed, by the beginning of the 20th century, most people accepted that these things were spurious. But in recent years, there's been a turnaround. There's been a lot of big drive to claim that that Josephus was indeed writing about something he had experience of. People have claimed that it might be a statement made by Josephus that has been added to, perhaps. There's this sort of partial validity claim that's going around at the moment. Well, I completely dispute that, as do people like James Mason and Earl Doherty, etc. And there's no doubt, if one does their homework, it's quite obvious, in fact, that those three interpolations that I've mentioned, the Testimonium Flavianum, the Baptist passage and the James passage, are clearly forgeries, interpolations. And we even now know who probably made those forgeries because of the way they've been done and the particular use of phraseology and the way they are expressed. I hope that kind of gives you an introduction to the problem.
Yes, it does. Can you go into the three passages some more, like into the details? What about them specifically does it tell us? What do they? How is it that the three passages themselves inform us who actually wrote them?
Okay, well, let me start with the Testimonium Flavianum, since that's the, shall we say, most critical interpolation. I'm going to read to you in English a translation of the interpolation. And actually, before I do that, let me just say this. If one reads Josephus's texts, and he wrote 4 books, which amount to something like 8 times the length of the New Testament in terms of words. So it's a very large corpus of information. And if you look at what we are assuming is Josephus's legitimate writings, he himself makes it very, very clear, repeatedly, that he is a Jew, a noble Jew, whose family stretches back in time, that he is a devout Orthodox member of his religious belief, that he has noble blood, that he has absolutely no time for impostors. He blames the whole destruction of the temple and the loss of the Jewish homeland to his own people accepting fraudulent religionists. The amount of time he spends attacking false prophets and so-called messianic peoples is quite intense, and he doesn't mince his words either. He's quite direct. Also, when he talks about somebody, he will praise them when they agree with him, and he will slate them when they don't. And he tends to, there are a few exceptions, but he tends to spend a lot of time introducing the characters that he's speaking about in his texts. He doesn't just jump in and talk about somebody. He first introduces them, makes sure you understand the context, and then he attacks them or praises them. So I'm giving you a very basic approach here. There are some exceptions to what I'm saying, but that tends to be the pattern with Josephus. Now, suddenly we're in the middle of book 20 of the Antiquities, and he's talking about what's happening in Rome, and suddenly he jumps in and he says the following. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of the Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." Now, when you look at the Greek, it's 89 words, this particular insert, which just suddenly appears in the middle of another another narrative. This narrative, the Testimonium Flavianum, breaks the flow of what he's been speaking about, suddenly making you aware that there was this other chap around at the same time as Pilate, called Jesus. And if you look at those 89 words, the following comes out. There are 16 points that Josephus supposedly makes with these 89 words. First, Jesus actually existed, and he still exists, even though he's dead. Jesus was wise. Jesus was and still is something superior to mortal humans. Jesus was a genuine miracle worker, which is really strange for Josephus to say, considering he has no time for any miracle worker. He says that Jesus was a teacher of the truth, also very strange. Jesus attracted and ministered to both the Jews and the Greeks. Jesus was the Messiah. He uses the word Christos. And maybe I should just stop there and say that is really strange, because the word Christos doesn't mean the same as, well, let me put it this way. In modern times, we refer to Jesus as being the Christ, and after a couple of thousand years, we have a kind of a feeling, we know what that means. We believe it means the anointed one, and that it's very similar to having a Mashiach in Hebrew, somebody who's anointed. But the word Christos in the first century didn't mean that. It meant somebody who had been dipped in oil, or dipped would be the better translation. So he's basically telling us that Jesus was dipped. From a first century point of view, a Greek wouldn't even understand what that meant. It doesn't make any sense. Then he says Jesus was condemned by the Jewish leadership, which is very pointed, because later Christians made a big thing about Jesus being shopped by the Jews and blaming the Jews and saying that the blood of Christ was on the Jews now and forevermore. This is very interesting that a devout Jew would almost condemn himself in this particular text. Jesus was sentenced to death by Pontius Pilate. He says that Jesus died on a cross. He tells us that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day. This is quite blasphemous stuff for a devout Jew to be talking about in the first century. He says that Jesus appeared to his loved ones after his death. So he's talking about the resurrection. He says that Jesus had and still has devoted disciples. Then he makes this other claim that Jesus fulfills divine prophecy. And then he says there are 10,000 divine proofs concerning his status, and that Jesus and his message continues to have a successful legacy. Now, that is, by all accounts, a confession of faith. And the only way Josephus could have written that is if he was a closet Christian. And not only a closet Christian, he would have had to have been a Christian who had access to 2nd and 3rd century theological concepts. In other words, he would have had to have been an incredible prophet for telling the future of Christianity. Because don't forget, this was supposedly written in the last years of the 1st century, not the 2nd or 3rd. So already we have a huge problem here. It's just too convenient. I also think we need to say something about, yes, there's a, if one goes to Luke 24, there is a narrative in there which we call the Emmaus narrative. And if you read verses 19 to 21 and verses 25 to 27, you are told exactly the same things that appear in the Testimonium Flavianum. In other words, the Testimonium Flavianum has a gospel feel about it, which is also very peculiar. May I also add that if you read the 2 larger volumes that Josephus wrote, that's the Judean War and then the Antiquities of the Jews, he tells us very clearly that there were only 3 religions available in Judea at the time that he was alive. And Josephus was alive a few years after the supposed crucifixion event. He was a governor in Cana. He was a general. He fought the Romans. And basically, he was around there just shortly after, as I say, the death of Jesus. So he was there almost at the same time. And he's telling us that after Jesus's time, after his death, there were only 3 religions in, or so we say 3 cults or 3 denominations of Judaism available. One was the Sadducees, the other was the Pharisees, and the last one was the Essenes. The Essenes are now identified with what we call the Qumran community, the Sons of Light. And they themselves seem to be very proto-Christian in their ideas, but they were not Christians. He does not mention Christianity. He doesn't mention Nazarites or Nazarenes. He doesn't mention anything that comes even close to what Jesus or later Christians thought that Jesus stood for. So this whole interpolation is completely out of context. It's from the wrong time period. It's alien. It shouldn't be there. So let's leave it there. There are more things we can talk about.
I'm going to take the super chat question real quick before I ask more about Josephus. Did Josephus have accesses to the Gospels? Thank you, woohoo, through your super chat.
Okay, the first problem we have there is that the 2 synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Mark, popular conservative wisdom says they were written about 30 years after the death of Christ. If that is true, then they were around in about 60 to 70 CE. So technically, if that is true, Josephus could have had access to the Gospels. But then the later Gospels, Luke is, I mean, that's a 2nd century construct, probably even later, and John is even later. So those would not have been possible. So if you want to be, shall we say, you want to be generous here, you could say that it's possible for Josephus, if he had known about it, to have read versions of Matthew and Mark before they themselves were interpolated and redacted, because they were. I mean, they were fiddled with and doctored over many years after that early period. So it's highly unlikely, but I suppose one would have to say it's possible, if that makes sense.
So I'd like to now shift to the James passage. And what is the problem with the James passage in Antiquities, Book 20?
Okay. The James passage is a very interesting piece of work, because the forgery is actually one line. And I believe there's actually something that's been taken out as well. There's an expurgation here. And the reason why I say that is because when you read the passage, which is supposed to be about the high priest called Ananus and his actions during the procuratorship of Albinus, in that he arrested and judged James the Just, and then condemned him to be stoned. And when you read the text, I won't read it all out because it's a long text, but the Romans apparently were very upset that Ananus stoned James the Just. Very angry about it. And that doesn't make sense either, because why would they be angry with a Jewish leader punishing Jews? It just doesn't even make sense. And the interpolation, I just want to find it for you. The passage that causes a problem is, it says, Festus was now dead, that's the previous procurator, and Albinus was but upon the road. Now, conventional wisdom says that Albinus became procurator in 62 CE, and Festus apparently died while he was in service as the procurator of Judea. So Ananus, who's the high priest, did something in the interim, in the interregnum between Festus and Albinus. And according to this, it says that Ananus assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, it says here, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So he doesn't actually tell us what these people did. We don't know what they did. All we know is they're breakers of the law. That could mean anything. Okay, it's very, what's the word? Very minimal. And yet we're also told in the same passage that the Romans were very upset by this. They didn't like the fact that Ananus had done this. And that doesn't make sense. But now if, as is typical of Josephus, he had introduced this topic properly, he would have told us a little earlier on what these people had done that was so offensive. And if we assume that the introduction of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, is an interpolation, and that in fact originally there was some other name there before it was removed and replaced, then the preceding information that's now missing would have told us what these people had done, and then it would have made more sense. And we would also have known probably why the Romans were offended, because perhaps the people that he's trying were not Jews, or maybe he had overstepped his boundary in that area. We just don't know, because all the text says is that Ananus arrested these people for breaking the law and then stoning them. Then if you look at the interpolation or the suspected interpolation, to be fair, it refers to Jesus as though everybody knows who he is, which is impossible, because a Jew reading this in the first century would have no clue who Jesus was, because many people were called Jesus. I mean, in Hebrew, the Yeshua, in Aramaic, Yeshu, they are common names. You would have to spell out that this is Yeshua bar Yosef to have any hope of somebody knowing what we're talking about. But he doesn't do that. He says that James was the brother of Jesus, as though everybody in the world knows who Jesus was. That's just impossible. So James's identity is based purely on us knowing who Jesus was. And then he says, this is Jesus who was called Christ. And then we come back to the other problem. Nobody would have understood what Christ meant. Christos means to be anointed with oil, in the sense that you're dabbing your finger in some oil and touching it on the object. For example, the word Christos was sometimes used when referring to a sacred sculpture of a deity. You would you would put oil on the sculpture because it represented a deity. So the meaning of the word Christos would not have been apparent to somebody at that time. Also, if Josephus was trying to imply that this Jesus was a Messiah, he would have made that more obvious. A Mashiach, for example, is a very specific Hebrew word which means the anointed one. It's normally applied to kings, people in authority, who have special powers granted to them, and to confirm that they are then anointed. So we have the same problem we have with Testimonium Flavianum. We have the sudden insert of somebody who's not been introduced. Nobody would know who this Jesus was. The person who's being stoned, James, is also somebody that we don't really know who is, unless you are a Christian who understands the legend or myth of James being stoned. It's a very popular Christian story. So you would have to have been a Christian to know the story. And so here we again have this feeling that whoever put this into this text was assuming that the reader knew who James and Jesus were, that they knew the tradition. And if they knew the tradition, this would have been a little bit later than the first century as well. And so that's the reason why we suspect it's a forgery. And go on and say that the same chapter that this appears in also has John the Baptist interpolation, which is also a suspected forgery, and that both of these interpolations are mentioned directly by Origenus in the 3rd century in the same book. In other words, he mentions both suspected interpolations. He mentions them factually in his own writings, which is very suspicious. And as I will tell you later, it's now most likely that Origenus was the person who is guilty of this particular forgery, whereas Eusebius is the most likely forger for the later Testimonium Flavianum. And may I just add on this point, the Testimonium Flavianum, which was in Eusebius's copy of Josephus in the 4th century, is not mentioned by anybody in the 2nd and 3rd century, including Origenus. And there's a whole list of Christian authors and fathers and apologists. I've got a list of over 16 of these people, and not one of them mentions the Testimonium Flavianum, which would have been so useful for them in their endeavor to support the notion that there's extra biblical evidence for Christ's existence. which again points very strongly to Eusebius having put it in the 4th century. So I think leave it there for now. If you have any more questions.
When is the earliest evidence date that points to a very clear existence of the Christian movement?
Well, I think it's Paul who tells us when the word Christian was first used, or suggests that it was first used. Either Paul or Luke, I can't remember now, but before that time, Christians were called Nazarenes, which seems to be a conflation of the word Nazarite and the actual town of Nazareth. If they were talking about people being Nazarites, that would fit in with the Jewish tradition that certain people took an oath where they grew their hair long and they didn't drink wine, and they made a vow that they would do this for a number of years. For example, Samson was a Nazarite. And I think later Christians who forgot the Jewish connection conflated the word Nazarite with Nazareth, the town. And the reason why we think that is because Nazareth didn't actually exist at the time of Jesus from our best evidence. In fact, it turns out that Nazareth was probably more likely to be a late 1st century, early 2nd century village, and it was very Romanized. There was a lot of Roman activity there. So we know that the early Christians, who also, many of them were Gnostic, probably call themselves Nazarenes, and I'm spitballing here, around about 50 to 70 CE, they were groups that started calling themselves Christians. These groups were not unified in any way. There were many groups, and in fact, if you think of all the mystery religions that were floating around at that time, and all the cults, the worship of Isis and Serapis, and the mysteries of Mithras, there were many crossover cults. We have reports that people worshipping Serapis in Egypt appeared to be very similar in appearance to Christians. It wasn't a uniform group. They had their own theologies. They had their own texts. You must remember, it wasn't until 380 CE that the church finally canonized the books that appear in the New Testament. At that time, they chucked out certain books and other books were put in. So up until that time, there was no uniformity. As an example, I'm just putting this out there for a bit of fun. The Gospel of John nearly didn't make it. The fact it's in the modern New Testament is purely an accident of history. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Can you tell us a bit about the historical Paul? Like, when was he active? Do you think he wrote letters? How many letters do you think he wrote? And my last question to that, my last part to that question is, what do you think Paul's view of Jesus was?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, many Christians don't know this, but Paul's letters are technically older than the Gospels. So if you wanted to put the New Testament back together in chronological order, if that's even possible, I'd put Paul's letters first. But Paul, in many ways, should be considered the founder of Christianity, because he's the first person to really try to come up with a theology. He seems to be very aware of the fact that he never knew Jesus personally, and that's why he calls himself an apostle and not a disciple. And there seems to be some suggestion that early Christians who were alive at that time, who knew Jesus, and here I'm talking about people like Peter specifically, and possibly even James, they tended to look down on him. That seems to be the feeling, because he didn't actually know Jesus. And the reason why that's so important is because in that culture, if you knew somebody personally, it had more authority than if you had heard about them. The same goes with texts. If you speak from the heart, having known something, that had more validity than writing it down and quoting it. Now, of course, assuming that Jesus actually did live and did exactly what the gospel said he did, and that's another debate, we'll just be generous here and say that the gospels are an attempt to capture what he did while he was alive. The gospels would have been considered secondary to hearing somebody speak about Jesus directly. Now, here comes a guy, Paul, who's never seen Jesus, and he is formulating a new theology, which has, again, very strong Gnostic undertones. And we only know about his theology through these letters. There is a feeling that some of these letters are, I won't say outright fraudulent, but they are heavily redacted. The ones that are more genuine and seem to be more direct seem to be combinations of letters, because I'm quite sure that Paul wrote more than, say, 9 letters in his whole life. He must have written loads of them if he was running these communities in Asia Minor. So some of the more famous letters could be as many as 3 letters combined. And in that sense, these letters have a didactic function. They were used by the early Christians to teach Christianity, and that was their function. So they are put together by later redactors to help Christians understand their faith better.
And when in the first century do you think that the historical Paul was active in writing?
Well, we don't have any reason to doubt that he must have existed. I think there's far more evidence for Paul having been a real person than, say, John the Baptist or Jesus. I'm not saying that Jesus didn't exist. I'm just saying, in terms of actual evidence, the letters of Paul seem to be more convincing that he was a real person. So I have no doubt he lived. The problem I have with Paul is that he contradicts himself. So let's put it this way. Whoever redacted his letters and is speaking for Paul contradicts himself, because we're told that I think there's a mention that he was a Pharisee, and we're also told that he went to the high priest and got permission to go on a journey to Damascus to terrorize and oppress Christians. I mean, that just doesn't ring true. Why would a Pharisee, first of all, be so obliged to a Sadducee leader and then leave Jerusalem, which is run by Romans, I might add, and then wander off to Damascus to go and victimize Christians? It just doesn't make sense. It's completely anti-Jewish to do that. So there are things in there which just don't make sense. I can't take it at face value. But what we could say is he obviously had Jewish roots. I'm quite sure he was very knowledgeable about Torah. And from what he speaks about, I would also say that he had Gnostic teachings. And there seems to be a lot of Gnosticism that crept into early Christianity before it was deliberately removed. We see elements of that in the Gospel of John, for example, when they start talking about the Logos. The Gnostic Christians didn't see Christ as a real person. They saw him as an aspect of the monads, what's the word I'm looking for? Manifestation. The monad was a concept even higher than God. It was a force of goodness which emanated rays, and out of the rays came the Father and the Mother, and the lowest emanation was wisdom, and it had one of its emanations was called the Christ, and the idea was that all of us, in our attempt to remove ourselves from the realm of evil and materialism and aspire to the realm of the pleroma, the realm of light, was to become what they called a psychic and gain spiritual knowledge. That's why it's called Gnosticism. And you did that by becoming a Christ. Everybody could become a Christ. Christ was kind of the perfect you, the best version of you, if you like, and which guaranteed you eternal life and also connection with the monad. So you can see how that also features in how Christianity developed. This idea that he's an intercessor, Christ is the intercessor between us as fallen, evil, wicked, dark beings, and wanting to move us into the light so that we can be with God the Father. Those ideas come from Gnosticism, and they were borrowed and made more literal, shall we say. And there's no doubt that Paul has this aspect too in his teachings, because he never knew Jesus. He doesn't talk about Jesus as a physical person. He doesn't talk about his childhood. It's always, he talks about things in a more spiritual way. Does that help?
Yes, it does. What do you make of the reference in Galatians about James, the Lord's brother, and also Paul's reference to Peter? Does Paul seem to be in conflict with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus?
Yes, well, that, as I said earlier, that seems to be the implication. We get the feeling that there was a pressure group led by by Peter specifically. We have no real evidence for this, except that you get the feeling from reading Paul's letters and later the Acts of the Apostles, which traditionally was written by the same person who wrote Luke. I mean, we have no proof that Luke wrote Luke, but it's a tradition that he did. And whoever wrote Luke also wrote the Acts of the Apostles. And if you read the Acts of the Apostles and you read the letters of Paul, you get this feeling that there was a bit of a tension between the circumcision party and the ones who said, if we're going to have a new religion and we're going to follow Jesus as the Lord and Savior, he's not just a physical teacher, he's actually now God, which is what he became. He moved from being a teacher to a deity. That we don't need to do this. We don't need to circumcise and eat, kosher food anymore. And that's where we have that imagery of the cornucopia coming down from heaven with all the foods available to the believer, which emphasizes the split between these two major groups. And in addition, there's the problem that Paul claimed to have known Jesus, which gives him far more authority than, Peter claims that he actually knew Jesus personally, which gives him a lot more authority than somebody like Paul, who says, well, I didn't actually know Jesus while he was alive, but I saw him when he was dead. He came and saw me, and he had the Damascus incident where he was blind, and then he got his eyesight back through a miracle, and he was using that to claim that he had a very close association with Jesus, but on a spiritual level.
And when would you date the Gospels of Mark and Matthew? Would you put them in the 2nd century as well, or in the late 1st century?
Yeah, it's really very difficult, because the trouble is Christianity we all assume that the founder was Jesus. The problem is that many of those ideas predate the time of Jesus. I mean, we see elements of Christianity in the Sons of Light movement in the 3rd century BCE, or you will say at least the 2nd century BCE. As a bit of a background, if you look at the so-called Old Testament, what as Jews we call Tanakh, okay, the Torah and the writings. When Israel was destroyed in 721 BCE and removed off the face of the earth, the Judeans in the kingdom of Judah tended to look at the destruction of Israel as Yahweh's punishment for their infidelity. And they constantly whine about the king, worshipping idols, or there's always some reason why this happened. It's explained. History is explained as the Jewish faithful turning their back in some way on Yahweh, and then Yahweh punishes them. And then the meta text says something like, if you read Isaiah, it's a very good example of this. Then God says, well, Yahweh says, look, I was angry with you, but now I'm going to take you back. If you promise to be good. And then he punishes the people who he used to punish the Jews in the first place. So the Neo-Assyrians, for example, are now punished for having destroyed Israel. And you get the feeling that whenever something goes wrong, they're happy to say, well, it's because somebody crossed the line. But when you get to the 3rd century BCE, which is now at least 400 or 500 years later, I think the average Jewish leader or spiritual leader was getting a bit tired of that excuse. They were trying to find a reason why the Jews were still oppressed. Remember, the Judeans were under the yoke of the Neo-Assyrians, and then the Neo-Babylonians, and then the Achaemenid Persians, and then the Seleucids, and then they had a brief respite with the Hasmonean dynasty, and then Pompeius Magnus marches into Jerusalem in 63, and they're under Roman rule. So the Jews never really had a nation where they ruled it themselves. They were always, as we say, holding the wrong end of the stick. All right, they didn't have a good time. And by the 3rd century BCE, they were looking for ways to explain this problem theologically, and then you start getting a lot of apocalyptic texts. You've got the writings of the Essene groups, like the Sons of Light, where they talk about now a deity who, from the beginning of time, had preordained who would be redeemed by him. This is a completely new type of Judaism. They start talking about entities, evil entities. The Satan, for example, now becomes a personification of evil. And people are deemed to be wicked and evil and followers of the Satan, and that they will all be punished in an afterlife. And these are very new concepts, because in Torah, there's no mention of afterlife. I'm not saying Jews didn't believe in afterlife, but it's not prescribed, it's not written. Now suddenly it becomes a very important issue, especially with the Pharisees. They say God can't be so nasty that he doesn't give you eternal life. And what's more, he's going to punish you in the eternal life if you're bad. Death is not enough, because the Torah talks about death as a final thing. Now suddenly death is an eternal thing where you're going to be punished. And if you're good, then you're going to get an eternal life. This is very new stuff. This is not Judaism proper. It's a new type of Judaism, borrowing from other religions like Zoroastrianism, maybe, and Greek ideas. So we see a change happening in the theology, an attempt to try and explain why things are going bad for the Jews. And they want to retain the Torah, but they also want to modify some of their beliefs to have a better explanation of why things are going bad for them. And the idea came eventually that these must be the last days. Yahweh has a plan. He's going to punish the Romans one day in the last days, and all those who are true Jews, followers of the second covenant, will be redeemed. So that's a very strong motivation, and Christianity grew out of that idea. Sorry, what do you want me to? This is background information to answer your question. Just give me your question again in detail, so I can.
Yeah. When do you date Mark and Matthew?
Right. Okay. So now you already have this movement who are now trying to make sense, if you like, of their condition. It is possible that the notion of Jesus is based on other miracle workers, messianic figures, because there were loads of them running around at that time. And maybe the concept of Yeshu, which means savior, by the way, very convenient that the savior, his name is Savior. That's one of the reasons why I have a problem with this, because if his name was John, I'd find it easier to believe. But anyway, the savior, who's going to become the savior of the Gentiles, is portrayed as preaching, these are the last days, there's a kingdom coming, and there will be redemption. And then the idea comes that there's evil. And then the idea that we are born with this evil, that we can do nothing about it. This is not mainstream Judaism, because mainstream Judaism, up until that point, preached, if you like, and I'm generalizing here, is that we're born with a pure soul. You turn away from the deity, and then you can go back to the deity through teshuvah, which is a process of begging forgiveness and changing your ways. Whereas the Christian message is that you basically can't do that anymore. Yahweh can't forgive you. You have to accept that he incarnated, and his incarnation paid this price for you. It becomes very materialistic, that sin is looked upon as some kind of negative force that has to be bought or got rid of through this payment of blood on the cross. And when one reads Mark and Matthew and realizes that they have very similar content and even similar phraseology, it seems that they were based on an older document. The Germans call it Kel or Q. And if there was an older document, it may very well have been based on an oral tradition. And it's possible that that oral tradition started or was at least inspired by things that an historical Jesus or historical persons did, plus all the baggage from the 3rd century BC onwards, the apocalyptic teachings, the striving for a new theology, the idea that these are the last days, etc., etc. Which means that there may have been stuff written down. For example, the Wisdom of Solomon, we are told that wisdom will come down to earth as a female and will be rejected by mankind. That idea is taken up in the Gospels, that Christ comes down and he's rejected by mankind. So it's a very similar story, except Christ is male. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the ideas that are contained in the Gospels were around a long time before the predicted, well, so the assumed date of the third decade after the death of Jesus. The theologies are old, much older. The placing it in a Jesus context of a wandering chassid who's now preaching in Judea is more modern. And as I said, possibly was an oral story that developed. What the cause of that was, we have no clear evidence of, except that if you are a believing Christian, you'll believe that it's based on Jesus' actual life. And I don't have a problem with that because we don't know. We really don't know. So I think the best guess here is to say that possibly within, say, 10 to 15 years after the death of Christ, after Jesus, rather call him Jesus of Nazareth, shall we say around about 40, 45 CE, there must have been something written down by then, because, as I said, when the person dies and can no longer speak for themselves, or somebody cannot speak on their behalf, the written word is the fallback. So the oral tradition becomes a text. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew appear to have been contain evidence that they were around before the destruction of the temple. So they must predate, I would say, around about 70. Then we have the destruction of the temple. We have convenient mentions of Jesus prophesying the destruction, which is also an indication that some of those passages were written after 70, because it's very easy after the event to say that somebody said it was going to happen before. So 70 to 80 seems to be a good guess. But the problem is there's other stuff there that was redacted much later. I'll give you one example because it gets complicated. If you read Matthew, he mentions that John the Baptist baptizes Jesus. Now that must have been a problem in later theology, because why would a lesser being be the person baptizing the Son of God? So when that was first written, it was probably because Jesus was considered to be a mortal, a teacher, and John the Baptist was the teacher. John the Baptist was the scenic guru, and Jesus was part of his group. That's the impression that's given. So later you see that the text changes. It has John the Baptist asking, do I have permission, basically, to baptize you? Because you are greater than me. And then Jesus said, no, it's okay, it's fine. And then when you read Luke and John, well, in Luke, it goes to the point where it just says Jesus was baptized, doesn't even mention John doing it. So in Luke, and in John, there's no mention at all. So you can see how the story has changed subtly over a few hundred years. So there's many aspects of Mark and Matthew, although they may have been around in some written form by 80 CE, there's no doubt stuff was added in the 1st century and the 2nd century.
Can you tell us about other examples of Oregon of Alexandria engaging in pious fraud?
Pious fraud was quite rife. How about letters written by Tiberius Caesar begging the Senate to basically convert to Christianity, because he's just been told that there was this wonderful spiritual thing that happened in Jerusalem and they all need to know about it. I mean, they're talking about Tiberius Caesar now. I mean, can you imagine Tiberius Caesar actually saying that? Letters from Pontius Pilate, where he admits his mistake in killing the Messiah. And hilarious stuff. Texts which talk about what happened to Judas. I mean, some of them are border on, well, I mean, they're really over the top. But perhaps not good to talk about them on a public group, because people might be offended. But pious fraud was rife. Eusebius, as I said, Eusebius actually admits to it in one of his texts. He says, if you have no choice, it's okay to lie, because it's better the person's soul is saved That's the important message. You want to save these people. You don't want them to go to hell. So you do whatever you have to do. Origen says something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, I remember him saying something like, the place of Jesus' crucifixion is well known because it was prophesied by the Jews. I mean, this is total nonsense. It never happened. Also, you have these wonderful exchanges between the author where they're trying to work out why the temple was destroyed. And they all had their different theories. Some said it was because Jesus was crucified. Others said, no, it was because James was stoned. And then you have these arguments raging between authors about why this happened. So leave it there. The reality was, I think people up until say the 3rd and 4th century had just assumed that what they believed was true. Nobody's going to question it. And then suddenly they get attacked by people like Celsus, for example. Origen wrote a book against Celsus. We don't know what Celsus actually said because the book was destroyed by Christians, but by what Origen says against Celsus, we have a good idea of what Celsus said in his book. And Celsus is basically saying, your belief is nothing more than a myth. There's nothing new about it. Look at what other religions and what they are claiming. I know a religion which has a guy who also was raised from the dead and did miracles. So what's so different between that religion and your religion? And so Origen has got to prove to his reader that Jesus actually lived. And he wants to do it without having to refer to the New Testament. So what does he do? He says, oh, well, look, read Josephus. Hear what he has to say about James and what he has to say about John the Baptist. And of course, the original Josephus didn't have anything in it about James or John the Baptist. So Origen simply put it in. The Eusebius had the same problem. So he suddenly found he had no information about an historical Jesus, so he made it up. Josephus said it, and not only that, Josephus manages to have a confession of faith, a biblical gospel like confession of faith. Does that help?
Yes, it does. I'd like to go back to the John the Baptist passage. What is the evidence implicating that Origen of Alexandria as being the likely culprit behind the John the Baptist passage?
Okay, John the Baptist is a fascinating one. Again, I support Origenus as being the forger of this. And if you haven't actually read the passage, it's difficult to talk about it. It's a very long passage. Try to wonder what would be best. I don't want to bore everybody by reading this out. So I'm wondering if I can. I'm going to quote from Zindler. Zindler has written some really good stuff about John the Baptist. Okay. If you read the Baptist passage, which is long, it's really long, there are two sections to the Baptist passage, and in the middle is the interpolation. It's exactly the same problem we have with the Testimonium Flavianum. You're reading along, everything sounds kosher, and then suddenly you're given some information that doesn't quite fit, and then Josephus goes back to talking about what he was talking about. And that's a giveaway that whatever's in the middle of that long text is foreign. Okay, I think that makes sense. So the Baptist passage, the fraudulent Baptist passage, is the same thing. You're reading along. If you go to lines 116 to 119, if you remove sections, lines 116 to 119 from the passage, then you get something that actually makes sense. And here I've actually got a quote to help you. So you're reading along, and you're told, so Herod wrote about these affairs to Tiberius, who, being very angry at the attempt made by Aretas. Aretas was the Arabian king, and he was also the father-in-law of Herodotus. Wrote to Vitellius to make war upon him, and either to take him alive and bring him to him in bonds, or to kill him and send him his head. This was the charge that Tiberius gave to the president of Syria. If you then jump over the Baptist passage, 4 lines, it carries on. So Vitellius prepared to make war with Aretas. That makes perfect sense. Okay? But the Baptist passage says, now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God. That's got nothing to do with what he's talking about. So suddenly we've got this thing. And that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist, for Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and so to become to baptism. It mentions baptism. Okay, remember, this is a Jew who's writing this. Now he's talking about baptism, for that the washing with water would be acceptable to him, if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away or the remission of sins. That's another problem. Jews technically don't believe in sin as a Christian does, or a Muslim. The word sin is a simile for iniquity and wickedness. That's fine. You can use words like that. But it's not a black spot against your name that can't be washed away. Okay, that's a Christian concept. He says here, not in order for the putting away of some sins, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. And it goes on, blah, 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 blah. And then it talks about John the Baptist being made a prisoner and being sent to Machaerus, which is a castle in Arabia. Okay, so that is the piece that's stuck in the middle of the longer text, which causes disruption. Okay, so as Zingler says, this action clearly highlights the possibility that the Baptist passage is a clumsy interpolation, as its presence disrupts the continuity. Okay, the original story is the interaction between Aretas the fourth, Herod Antipas, Tiberius Caesar, and Vitellius. The second reason why we think it's a forgery is because the Baptist passage contradicts previous information written about the fortress of Machaerus. The fortress is recorded much earlier in the passage. And then we're told in the Baptist passage, the interpolation, that Herod Antipas sent John the Baptist to the fortress of Machaerus to be executed. Now there's a big problem here, because the text before the interpolation clearly tells us that that Herod and Herod Antipas and Aretas are at war with each other. So his previous father-in-law is now his enemy. The castle at Machaerus, or the fortress at Machaerus, belongs to Aretas. Why would Herod send his prisoner to a fortress that belongs to his enemy? It's just not possible. It contradicts what the passage said in the beginning. Okay. In addition, the interpolation says he was sent to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned. In other words, he's telling you that I mentioned Machaerus earlier in the text, but he's forgotten that if you read what he said earlier in the text, it's actually going to highlight the fact that his interpolation is obvious. The third reason why we suspect it's a forgery is that the Baptist passage contradicts the reasons for Herod Antipas's defeat at the hands of Aretas IV, because ultimately Aretas beat Antipas. If you read the passage before, it says, and thus did God punish Herodias for her envy at her brother, and Herod also for giving ear to the vain discourses of a woman. The Baptist passage says this happened because God was displeased with Herod Antipas's atrocious treatment of the Baptist. So in other words, we have two reasons why God punished Antipas, completely contradicting each other. The fourth reason is that, this is something I haven't mentioned before, but if you look at the historical aspects written in the Antiquities of the Jews and the historical aspects written in the Judean War, two separate books which are separated by at least 2 decades, Josephus mentions the same information. And that's very useful because he says the same thing, slightly differently, but it confirms what he's saying about the history of the Jewish people under Roman oppression. And in the war, there's no mention, for example, of Jesus was a wise man. It's only in Antiquities. Same problem with John the Baptist. This whole thing about John the Baptist Antipas displeasing God because of John the Baptist's execution is not mentioned in the war. And the same goes for James the Just being stoned. It's not mentioned. Which means that the interpolator only did it in the one book because that was the book that he felt he could get away with it because there were episodes in it that he could latch his information to and make the reader hopefully not suspect. Okay, there are other reasons, but they're not as important. The other thing I want to quickly mention is that this mention of baptism is a real fun one, because why would Josephus be so worried about a Christian technicality about baptism? And if you read Origenus, he talks specifically about baptism. And he's the one, as I say, we suspect wrote this interpolation. And let me give you a little bit of background on that. Origenus is a man living in the 3rd century. He believes in demons and bad spirits. He believes the world is flat. He believes that there's hell under the ground and heaven in the sky above. I mean, he's a typical Hellenistic man. That's what they believe. There's no science. He also believes in sympathetic magic. He believes that if you wash your hands with water and say the right prayers, they're not only going to be clean physically, they're going to be clean spiritually. He believes, and he actually tells us this, he says that if a person is baptized in the church, they automatically change their personality and become Christ-like. He tells us that. And of course, Celsus obviously said something like, how come you don't emphasize the fact that a person converts through intelligence, through wisdom, through discussion, and then converting because they are moved by the logic of the argument? It seems to me that even stupid people convert for all the wrong reasons, and he actually says Christians are stupid. So Origenus says Christians are not stupid. But if a stupid person basically gets baptized, they will also have their personality changed because they are now in Christ's fold. So he sees the baptism ceremony as a sympathetic, magical act that changes the nature of the person being baptized, rather than the person making a conscious, rational decision to become a Christian and then going through a ritual of baptism purely as an affirmation of their logical decision, which is really interesting because Origenus is basically promoting a magical effect here. So his comments about baptism in the John the Baptist passage tie in totally with that. And if you read the Baptist passage in its entirety with the interpolation, and then you read what Origenus has had to say to Celsus to convince him that Christianity is true, the following 6 points come out. The first one is that Jesus is the Son of God who brought him into the physical world through the medium of a virgin woman. That's a very important point. He wants to emphasize that the Holy Spirit appeared bodily, incarnate as a dove. Okay, that's the John the Baptist aspect. The divine voice from heaven was God the Father, and it actually occurred at the baptism event. He wants to emphasize that. He also wants to emphasize that Christian baptism has real spiritual efficacy and resulted in its recipient adopting godly qualities, regardless of their mental capacity. A person who displays Christ-like godly behavior subsequent to a Christian baptism is evidence of Jesus' divine status. Okay, that's, by the way, also pious fraud because that's a lie. And the gospel accounts of the baptism are true. And those are the things that Origen is trying to emphasize in his writings. And it is in that section that we see both the forgery of the Baptist and the forgery of James the Just. I think leave it there. I mean, I think that's enough.
Before we continue, I do want to ask one more thing about the John the Baptist passage. Could you expand a little more on the Machaerus, the fortress of Machaerus contradiction?
Sure. Machaerus is mentioned in the beginning of that particular chapter. We know that it belongs to Aretas IV, who was the king of the Arabians at that time. For example, Petra, that beautiful city of Petra, where that's all carved out of stone, is in the kingdom of Aretas. It's that area. His daughter is married to Herod Antipas, and Herod Antipas ultimately upsets Aretas by ditching his daughter and marrying Herodias, and they go to war. And in the Baptist passage, it tells us that he sends John the Baptist to Machaerus for imprisonment and execution. In other words, to have his head cut off. This cannot possibly be true because Machaerus doesn't belong to Herod Antipas. It belongs to Aretas. And he's no longer friendly with Aretas. Aretas is a very disgruntled and very upset father-in-law who's waging war against him. And ultimately, Antipas comes off second best. He loses that war. So the person who wrote this text didn't know his history. He sees the word Machaerus in the text and he thinks, oh, I know what I'll do. It mentions this fortress. I'll have him send John the Baptist to the fortress because that seems logical. And then he even says, he went to Machaerus. I mentioned it earlier in the text, okay? But if you know the whole story and you read what he says in the beginning and then what he says in the interpolation, you can see it's contradictory. Does that make more sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Um, how was James the Just understood by the church fathers?
From what I've read, you read Jerome and people like that who talk about him, he's sometimes conflated with St. Sebastian, the first martyr, who was stoned. You might remember that story. There was a Christian tradition that he was martyred. And, you know, some of the texts are fantastical. There's one text, I can't remember right now off the top of my head whether this was Eusebius or Origenus or somebody like a Jerome, but it tells us that he went to the top of the temple. What was it? He fell off the temple, and then they bashed his brains in with clubs before he died. And it's just over the top. It's just unbelievable to emphasize the pain that he went through. But the bottom line is, it was an early Christian tradition. It's a Christian tradition. It's another tradition that's very popular in the early centuries of the Christian church, especially when we get to the 7th and 8th centuries, is the story of Veronica wiping the face of Christ on the way to Calvary, and then the magical image that appears on the piece of cloth. These are famous stories. They don't have biblical backing. They're stories which are popular. And they become as strong as biblical texts because of the tradition. And whoever wrote the, well, I'd say Origenus did it, but when he talked about the procurator, Albinus, not having arrived yet, and that's what gave Annas, the high priest, the opportunity to stone James. He had no knowledge of history when he made that statement. We now know, for example, that Albinus went to Judea earlier than we thought. So back in the 2nd and 3rd century, somebody who was writing would have believed that Albinus only arrived in 62 CE. And he tries to fit that story in with the reign of Annas, the high priest. But in actual fact, Annas was reigning in 59 CE. And 59 CE is in fact the time when Albinus arrived, according to the coinage. And we can thank a scholar called Coccinus for this work. He wrote an incredible book. It's one of the most powerful pieces of research to come out in the last 2 decades. He talks about the Herodian dynasty. It's literally breaking research. It's really good. And thanks to that information, I mean, Coccinus didn't know about what we're doing here on this side, but it's been very useful to show that the interpolator put the insert in the wrong date because he didn't know his history. So he has the death of James happening between 3 and 13 years too early, even for the Christian tradition. But of course, somebody reading this in the 2nd and 3rd century wouldn't have known that. So it's just more evidence for it being a forgery.
How does Josephus treat other people named Jesus in his text?
Yeah. I have a list here, because I knew you were going to ask me that question. Okay, here we go. Josephus mentions 21 different Jesuses. But we're pretty sure that some of those Jesuses are the same Jesus. He's just describing him in a different way. In most cases, there are exceptions. He introduces them with a little bit of background information. So we have Jesus, the son of Now, Jesus, son of Saul, Jesus, the high priest, son of Phineas, Jesus, son of the high priest Zozdak, Jesus, son of Joiada, Jesus, high priest, son of Simon. It goes on and on. Jesus the Christ is the 9th Jesus he mentions. And he mentions one Jesus, which is actually quite interesting. Jesus, son of Ananias, if I can find it. Yes, Jesus, son of Ananias, a rude peasant who prophesies the fall of Jerusalem. Now, this is very interesting. I am pretty convinced that the mention of Jesus the Christ is blatant forgery. But one of his mentions of a Jesus which sounds valid has interesting parallels with the biblical account of Jesus of Nazareth. Isn't that amazing? Which gives rise to the possibility that this was the kind of story that would have been taken and used to find information to flesh out a hypothetical living Jesus character in the Bible. Josephus tells us that just before the destruction of the temple, we're talking about 70 CE, a very rude, low-class peasant kept walking around and saying, "Woe unto Jerusalem." And that's very similar to what Jesus was supposed to have said. Jesus of Nazareth was supposed to have said back in the 30s. And apparently people felt sorry for him. They'd give him food and clothing and try to help him, and he would be rude to them and tell them to go away. So he tended to be shunned by society, and he walked around shouting, "Woe unto Jerusalem, woe unto Jerusalem." And then the destruction of the temple started. Titus came into Jerusalem, and there was destruction of buildings and, chaos. And a giant rock that had been chucked out of a mangonel apparently hit Jesus, son of Ananias, and he was killed. So that's quite interesting, because we have a prophetic kind of figure walking around trying to preach. He's not polite. He rejects people's attempts to help him, and he's ultimately killed by a giant rock. Other Jesuses that he mentions, I think in one case he talks very, very highly of, because as I said before, if the person agrees with Josephus and supports his agenda, then he tends to speak very highly of them. But they are very rare. In fact, I can only think of about 2 or 3 cases in Josephus's work where he really speaks highly of somebody. And in that case, he will introduce the person and he will explain why he speaks highly of them. For the most part, Josephus is quite scathing of most people. And that includes the Jesuses here. Many of these Jesuses are high priests or sons of high priests. The only exception I can see here is the prophet figure, Jesus of Ananias, who was killed by the rock. We could also talk, kind of related, to the pseudo prophets, if you'd like to talk about them.
Sure.
There are quite a few of them. Now, in these cases, they're all spoken about in really quite aggressive language. We have Judas, the son of Ezekias, who was an arch robber. Simon of Perea, Anthrongs the shepherd, Judas the Galilean, who also had a long-running feud with him. Sadok the Pharisee. We have to include John the Baptist here because it's mentioned in the book, but of course that is also an interpolation. So I mention him purely for transparency. He mentions an unnamed wicked teacher of Mosaic law and his 3 partners. He mentions an unnamed Samaritan liar. Oh, he often refers to these people as, the word is goaz. It's a Greek term that means a false teacher, a wizard, a magician, a liar, a cheat would be a good example. Talked about, he mentions Herod Agrippa also, Theudas the charlatan, the Egypto-Jewish charlatan, who is also, by the way, mentioned by Luke, an anonymous zealot charlatan. He talks about Judas the Galilean's son, Manahem. He talks about John, son of Levi, Simon, the son of Giora. Simon, the son of Giora, he really slates because Simon, the son of Giora, had a wife who was kidnapped and held ransom by another group. And when he got his wife back, he massacred everybody because he was in a rage. And Josephus uses this as an example of what these false prophets really got up to. Some of them, for example, would take them off to the Jordan River and claim they were going to part the waters of the Jordan River so they could cross over to the other side. And Josephus was absolutely adamant in all his writings that these were the people that so offended God that God actually allowed the Romans to defeat them. He almost saw it as divine justice and that it was right that the Romans did what they did, which is quite interesting take. And again, another reason why one has to take with a pinch of salt him speaking so favorably about John the Baptist and, of course, Jesus of Nazareth. Jacob, anything else?
Yeah, so got a few more here. Well, what do we know about Papias, and is the information we have of him reliable?
Yeah. Papias is a big problem. Just go to got some notes here on him. Okay, Papias lived in the 2nd century. We know that. And he's mentioned by 2 authors, one being Irenaeus, who also worked in the late 2nd century, and our friend Eusebius, who's working in the 4th century. Papias tells us a story. Well, he doesn't tell us a story. Papias is quoted by both Irenaeus and Eusebius, who have read his text, as having met people who met people who met people who knew Jesus. And when you read the various extracts, because I mean there are many extracts here, and you put them all together, you get 2 interpretations of what Papias may have or may not have said. Papias may have claimed that Jesus's disciples, not Jesus himself, but his disciples and a group called the elders, he doesn't specify who they are, spoke with some people who met them, and those people ultimately met Papias, who, don't forget, Papias is living in the 2nd century, and Jesus is living in the beginning of the 1st century. So there's a big gap between the people who met Jesus' disciples and the elders and people who met Papias. The other possibility is Jesus' disciples spoke to the elders, and then the elders spoke to the people who met them, and then they spoke to Papias. But the facts are that if we're going to be kind and say, yeah, it actually happened like that, and you're going to trust hearsay based on hearsay based on hearsay as having any scientific validity, let's just be really generous and say, yeah, it all happened exactly as people want to believe. We still have no information about Jesus biographically. I mean, it doesn't help us. It doesn't tell us anything that we didn't already know. And that's the problem with all of these supposed extra biblical support documents for Jesus' existence. They tell us a lot about his followers living in the 1st and 2nd centuries and the actions of early Christians, but they don't tell us anything about Jesus. I mean, it'd be really great if they did. I mean, we'd love to have a piece of text that says, Jesus was, 5'6" and had, dark hair and what he ate and what he did and who his mother was. And that would be great. We'd have more information, but we don't. So that Papias doesn't really help us. People who are desperate to have something other than the New Testament to support their belief use Papias to support the claim that Jesus existed. And really, whether Jesus existed or not isn't the issue here with Josephus. It's not the issue. I mean, Jesus' existence, whether he existed or not historically, has got nothing to do with Christianity as a religion claiming that he's the Son of God. And that's the issue. I mean, even if people actually met a real historical Jesus, that doesn't tell us anything. So, as I say, being kind, it doesn't tell us anything about the historical person. Being very skeptical, you cannot use such, ephemeral information. It's just wishful thinking. I mean, Papias himself is not being direct, and again, we haven't got Papias directly. We've got a reference to Papias by another author, so it's not very useful.
What are your thoughts on the historicity of Flavius?
Oh, Flavius, sorry?
Flavius.
Oh, Thales. We know nothing about him, and we don't even know when he lived. We have some information from George Seneculus, who lived in the 9th century. I mean, that's assuming that Thales actually, let's say Thales lived in the 1st century, because he talks about the supposed earthquake and darkening of the skies that happened at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And Seneculus and Africanus both refer to this particular incident. And I think most people have heard, it's also a bit of a Christian tradition, but it is mentioned in the New Testament in a kind of a way, because there's one of the texts talks about I think it's the curtain of the temple was ripped in twain, and it talks about dead people walking around and the dark sky and the and earthquakes. And Thales is quoted as having talked about this terrible darkness, but not just in Judea. This darkness was over the whole world, so that everybody would know that something really, if I can use a James Ramby term here, a woo-woo was happening, a woo-woo incident, something really beyond our comprehension was happening. So powerful. And he says, for example, there was a complete solar eclipse at full moon from the 6th to the 9th hour. Now, Seneclus actually points out this doesn't sound right, and I think anybody listening to this podcast will realize why that's a bit of a tall order here. How can you have a full moon when you're having a solar eclipse? I mean, you need the moon to have the eclipse. So this shows you that whoever wrote this doesn't even know basic astronomy. Okay. Anyway, I had a lot of fun with this because Phlegon of Tralles also talks about this. And we have more evidence that Phlegon lived in the 1st century, but he's also quoted by church fathers like Origen, and he also talks about the solar eclipse that happened at the time of Jesus' death. Now, apart from the problem of the Passover, and remember, Jews used the full moon, or Rosh Chodesh, to mark time. You only know it's Pesach when you see the full moon. So it's a bit hard to work out how you suddenly have a solar eclipse at the same time. But what I did was, we are so blessed living in the 21st century. We have access to amazing information. I contacted NASA, who have a database where they have managed to recalculate every single solar eclipse in the last 5,000 years. That's amazing, eh? And I looked specifically at solar eclipses in the first 4 decades of the 1st century to see if there was anything that would indicate some kind of solar activity, lunar activity in Judea, around Jerusalem, at any time in those 4 decades. And the result was findings were there was no account, there was no total solar eclipse. Okay, and even if you have a total solar eclipse, it lasts for a few minutes at best, not 6 hours. There was no activity of any nature in or around Jerusalem between 23 and 43 CE. So I pretty much covered any possible date for the crucifixion here. And this includes all Roman crucifixions, regardless of the time of year. And so therefore, any account of Jesus being crucified at a time of an eclipse would have been pure fiction. And, you know, here again, we have the problem. Let's say there was a solar eclipse sometime in those first 2 decades. And then everybody goes, oh, well, that's when the crucifixion happened. Well, you don't know that. It's an assumption. And even if it was, what does it tell us about Jesus? Absolutely nothing. But people are grasping at straws. They desperately want something to prove that he existed at that time. And that's the reason why these texts are so important to Christians, because those who desperately need this to bolster their faith will literally be grabbing at straws. And the people who wrote these texts were grasping at straws to start with.
Yeah, I'd seen the mistake what I made earlier. When I wrote down phallus, I slightly misspelled it. That's why I pronounced it wrong. But when was phallus supposed to have lived anyway?
We don't know. We don't know. Some of these characters, there may have even been more than one Thales. I mean, we don't know. Just you can't say. Some people have assumed. I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I think a Christian author called Bruce theorized he lived in 52, but I may be wrong on that. But I mean, again, it's a thumbs up. Why even try? It's we just don't know. We're dealing with, another thing, when ancient authors wrote a text, when they reference another text, they did it in a very different way to the way we do it. I mean, they'll say something like, if you read, Joseph's Chronicles, I think it was the 13th or 14th volume, he says blah, blah, blah. It's based on faulty memory, even their referencing. They don't even bother to get the book out and say, it's definitely in book 13. They didn't use a referencing system like we did. Their understanding of history was different to us. When we write history, we're trying to uncover facts. To them, history is a kind of a setting that you use to give credibility to what you're talking about. Luke, for example, uses history very effectively to get his message across. He's trying to convert people to Christianity. So to make his words sound even more true, he places them in a historical context. And here's the irony: that often the things he speaks about did happen, but he puts them in the wrong time period, because that's not important. He's not interested in factual history. He's interested in presenting, he's interested in didactics, teaching, and making sure the person believes what he's saying. And to make it sound true, it has to be placed within some kind of setting that just sounds plausible. It's a very, very common trick used by a lot of Hellenistic authors.
Are there any references to the biblical Jesus in the Talmud, the Mishnah, and other Jewish writings?
Yeah, okay. Well, the Talmud has been abused. Let's get you something on the Talmud quickly. Oh, yeah, I know what I did here. Look, first of all, one must understand that the Talmud itself was put together over many centuries. Just to give it some kind of context, what happened is when the Jews realized that their faith was under attack, and a lot of people don't know this, but there's a written Torah and then there's an oral Torah. And the oral Torah was not allowed to be written down. It was memorized by people. And it's believed that there were people in the community whose task it was simply to memorize the oral. And this is important because if you think of the Torah, the written Torah, it doesn't really tell you much about what to do if somebody breaks one of the laws. Okay, and you've got these 613 mitzvot, commandments, and they'll say something like, you shan't boil a kid in its mother's milk. That's an example. And we know that it's wrong to do it, but what happens to the person if you do it? Do they get fined, and what are the contexts of that? And how do you go about judging their guilt? And so the oral Torah was used for that purpose. And the Sanhedrin, for example, had 70 or 72 wise judges who would sit in judgment of each case, and they would listen to it. And based on their wisdom, they would pass judgment suitable to the time. And when that was no longer possible, they broke their own ruling and they said, let's write down the oral law. We have no choice because we're losing it. You know, we're under oppression. There were Jews who moved off to Babylon, for example, to continue, their faith. And we have two major centers, for example, Jerusalem and Babylon. And Babylon ultimately produced the Babylonian Talmud, which is the more accurate one, the bigger one. And things were written down, we call that the Mishnah, and then there are commentaries on the Mishnah. And eventually we end up with a book which took centuries to put together, where we'll have various expert rabbis commenting on what's been put in there to try and help you understand how to apply the law in daily life. Okay? So when you have these stories that are told, they're normally told to illustrate a point, and then the rabbis pass comment on it. And there are 6 passages in the Talmud and the Tosefta, which over the last 1600 years, various people have claimed refer directly either to Jesus or to family members. And unfortunately, this is total nonsense. It's total nonsense. And I, for one, would love it if we had some information in the Talmud that would help give us some historical background. But unfortunately, this is all wishful thinking. And I'm not going to read through all 6 passages, and anybody can find out where they are. But in Shabbat 104b and the Sanhedrin 67a is the same passage repeated, which talks about somebody called Ben Starda, okay, in other words, son of Starda, who brought witchcraft from Egypt by means of scratches upon his flesh. He was a fool. And then it says that one of the rabbis says, was he then the son of Starda? Being Ben Starda, that makes sense. Surely he was the son of Pandera. So this rabbi is arguing he wasn't the son of Starda, he was the son of Pandera. And then Rabbi Hizda says the husband was Starda and the lover was Pandera. But the husband was Paphos ben Judah, and his mother was Starda. So another rabbi is saying, no, the mother was Starda, not the father, and the father was a guy called Paphos ben Judah. Now, we happen to know who Paphos ben Judah was, because in the Talmud, Paphos ben Judah is mentioned in connection with another famous person in history. Some of your viewers may know Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is famous in Jewish history because the tale about him, the narrative is that he was forced to renounce his Judaism. And to cut a long story short, he had his arms and his legs cut off. And he died most terribly. Now, if you realize that Rabbi Akiva was martyred in 137 of the Common Era, at the same time that, this Paphos ben Judah was apparently martyred, then how could he be related to Jesus of Nazareth? Again, it doesn't even begin to make sense. We're talking about something that happened 100 years, a century after the crucifixion date. But this is what people do. They wishful thinkers. Now, it says in this text, his mother was Starda, but his mother was Miriam, the hairdresser. How many Miriams do you think there are in Jewish history? Now, immediately you go, oh, Miriam, that's Mary. That's his mother. It's unbelievable. And then here's the biggest joke of all. The word hairdresser. In Hebrew, hairdresser is migadla nashaiya. Migadla. Migadla sounds a bit like Magdalene. So everybody says, oh, it's Mary Magdalene. Well, already there's a problem. If it was Mary Magdalene wasn't Jesus' mother according to the New Testament. So why even go there? But people do this. They go there and they make up these stories. And I can go on. All the other mentions in the Talmud and the Tosefta have the same problem. They're either 1 century too early or 1 century too late. And I am the first person who would love to see an actual mention of Yeshua bar Yosef, being hanged or crucified, during the Passover period. But it just isn't going to happen. It's not there. There are mentions of people being hanged and stoned on or near the Passover, but they're not in any way related to the Jesus of Nazareth. There's even a reference to followers of one of these heretical rabbis, and somebody's tried to suggest that this was Jesus of Nazareth's disciples. The names that they quote don't even bear any resemblance to the names of the followers of Jesus. And again, it's the wrong period. So unfortunately, it's a big no. There's just nothing in the Talmud that will help support extra biblical, in other words, mentions of a historical Yeshua bar Yosef.
What are the problems with the Christus passage in Tacitus's Annals?
Look, again, the passage clearly says that the Jews were rioting during the reign of Claudius, and there are 2 times that could have happened in the reign of Claudius, so that's not too important. Somewhere between 40-something and 50-something CE. Remembering in 40 to 50 CE, if you take Paul at his word, or Luke, I can't remember if it was Paul or Luke who said this, the word Christian hadn't even been invented yet. Okay. And secondly, the text doesn't talk about Christians. It talks about Jews. Okay. And quite frankly, let's say there was a breakaway group of Jewish proto-Christians at that time, which is not impossible in a big place like Rome. Do you think the Romans would have known the difference or even cared? It doesn't. It's ridiculous. And the leader of these Jews who rioted was a guy called Chrestus. Chrestus is a common name at the time. It just means good. It's got nothing to do with Christus, which means dipped. Chrestus means good. It's a slave name. And let's just for a moment imagine that we are talking about Jesus Christ, Jesus the Christ. What was he doing in Rome in 50 CE? He's supposed to be dead. It's unbelievable what people want to believe. It just doesn't even begin to make sense. And one scholar has done a lot of work on this and has found 41 versions of this text. And Christus is the most common spelling. The Christus spelling is a forgery. Somebody scratched the E out and put an I in it in the 11th century because they wanted it to become Christus. The facts are, it's got nothing to do with Jesus' followers. It's got nothing to do with Jesus. It is a bunch of Jews rioting, and they were expelled from Rome. And the leader was a guy called Christus. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, that was actually that was Suetonius, but I'm asking about Tacitus, the Roman historian Tacitus, and the fire of Rome, and him connecting it to Christians and the crucified Christus.
Yeah, Jacob, I've got somebody banging on my door. Can I quickly just see what
Sure.
that is about and come straight back? I don't want to mess up your interview. Just give me a second.
That's fine.
I'm sorry, I'm talking to Americans.
Can I ask the guys to open for me?
If you want to go up 141,
Yes. Can I take my cook with me? Go in that
take the card with you and I will send money to the Okay, my sincere apologies about that.
No problem.
Okay. Tacitus. What exactly did you want to know about Tacitus?
What your thoughts on it? Do you think it was genuine to Tacitus? It connecting Christians to the fire of Rome under Emperor Nero?
The, there's a bit of background information I must give. I'm not in any way saying Christians weren't persecuted by the Romans. They were. But it became very popular by the 4th century. And Tranquillus actually tells us this. He was a Christian convert. And he says that the blood of the Christians was the seed, which is an interesting statement. There was this narrative that came out by the 4th and 5th centuries that said that God himself wanted Christians to be martyred. It was necessary to get the world to become Christian, because remember, the Christians took over Christianity. Sorry, the Romans made Christianity the official Roman religion in the 4th century under Constantine. And they were trying to say this was kind of orchestrated by God himself by making sure that Christians looked forward to being martyred. The stories that come out of that period are quite fantastical. They read like romances. We have strange stories of lovers who never actually became physical because that was considered sinful, who one man was put into a prison cell that stank, and then angels made it smell like flowers, and then they tried to kill them, but they couldn't kill them, and then a man wants to rape the Christian woman, and then a lion escapes and kills the guy who's trying to rape the Christian woman, and they get totally fantastical stories that came out. And very often the people being martyred in these stories took on Christ-like identities. The places where the Christians were martyred became churches, for example, sacred sites. People used to go on pilgrimages in the 4th century to visit these sites because it was all part of the marketing of this religion. We're told that Christians lined up happily, people lined up happily to become converted so that they could be martyred, if you can believe this. And I take all of those stories with a pinch of salt. The reality is I cannot imagine Romans deliberately going around and martyring other Roman citizens just because they were Christian. What is true is that there were periods in Roman history where Christians were targeted. But it turns out this was mostly political, not religious. Romans were largely very forgiving of other people's faith. They tended to be, this is quite amusing, the low-class people tended to be more conservative than the upper classes, as a general rule, and I am generalizing. You found people from wealthy homes and nobility, the wives would perhaps be interested in becoming Jewish or experimenting with other religions because they were considered exotic. Your lower classes tended to say that wasn't loyal Roman behavior. There is an issue that in the empire, there was the cult of the emperor where a loyal Roman had to treat the bust of an emperor in such a way that they affirmed the deity of the emperor, because originally Gaius Julius Caesar, or Julius Caesar, he had been deified. And then later they wanted Augustus Caesar to be deified, and he very begrudgingly was. Claudius was deified in Colchester. And then after that, everybody was deified. Immediately they became emperor. And then it became a cult. The nearest analogy I can think of that is us saluting a flag today, showing that you're a loyal American and saluting the stars and stripes. You were not a loyal Roman if you didn't pay obeisance to the bust. And I think that Christians and Jews would have had a problem with that, because they would have said that's idolatry. The Jews were not targeted as much because they said prayers for the emperor in Jerusalem in the temple. So they were kind of let off that. But I should imagine some Christian groups offended people because of their unwillingness to do the Roman thing. But having said that, there were lots of cults in Rome, mysteries of Mithras, worship of Isis, Serapis, and they were very popular. We know that Augustus Caesar banned connections with Egypt during the time of Mark Antony and Cleopatra Philopator, because he wanted the Romans to think of Mark Antony as a traitor and Cleopatra Philopator as a witch. But after their deaths, Augustus Caesar used Egyptian elements in his architecture because he knew that he could convince the average Roman that Rome was now the master of the world and that they'd conquered Egypt. So Egypt was now subject to Rome. So he actually started bringing Egyptian stuff back into fashion. And there are many examples of public buildings being built, which support, say, Egyptian pharaonic belief systems. So that's some background there. Now, we go to Tacitus, and I'm thinking of Suetonius Tranquillus. They both mention Nero doing horrible things to the Christians. I think the text you're probably wondering about is where the Christians were turned into human torches at night. Now, I for one can't. I know that it's possible that Nero blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome, and I have no reason to doubt that. But to say that the Christians would be burnt as torches, apart from that particular passage, we have no other evidence that happened. So again, we don't have enough evidence. We don't have anything to back it up. We have nothing to support it. There is a possibility, and I'm not saying this happened, but there's a possibility that later Christian fathers interpolated or redacted those texts to make it look like the Romans really didn't like Christians and tried to exaggerate the level of violence against them. Again, I'm not saying this did happen, but it's not impossible that this happened. Without additional evidence, it would be very unwise and very arrogant, I think, to say either way. We just don't have enough information. And in popular culture, of course, Nero is painted as a bastard, and he's shown fiddling while Rome burns, and he is portrayed today in popular culture as burning Christians on stakes. Whether he deserves that, that treatment or not is open. But let's assume, again, to be generous, that everything that Suetonius says and everything Tacitus says is true. It still tells us absolutely nothing about an historical Jesus. Nobody denies there were Christians in Rome practicing Christianity. So what's the point? If you know that somebody's practicing Christianity in Rome in the early 2nd century, or the late 1st century, it's not new. We know that. Nobody's doubting it. But it doesn't tell us that Jesus existed or what Jesus did if he did exist. And that's the point everybody seems to be missing. These texts, there are loads of them, are pointed to all the time as evidence for Jesus' existence. They're not. They're evidence for followers of Jesus' existence. And some of them have been fiddled with to make the Jesus followers' existence miserable, to fit in with the martyrdom narrative that this was a necessary evil to bring Christianity into the world. That is the narrative that the church wanted at that time. I don't know if it still is the narrative of the modern Catholic Church, but certainly it's very popular for people to imagine that Christians were constantly being, subjugated to this sort of behavior. I hope that answers your question. I mean,
It does.
yeah. There's I can't remember her name. There's an author. She writes really well, and I'm having a mental blank. She has a collection of these romantic narratives about early Christian martyrdom, a whole book of them, and it's fascinating reading.
Are you talking about Candida Moss?
Yes, Candida Moss. Yes, I wrote an article about this years ago, and I mentioned her, and it's very entertaining stuff. I could give you an example. When you go to the catacombs in Rome, the Via Appia, you go down there and you see all those wonderful remains of the catacombs, which contain not only Christian remains, but also Jewish and also Greco-Roman polytheistic cults are in there. And the people in charge of the catacombs, they tell the tourists the same thing. This is where all the martyrs were buried. The Christians had a bad time for 400 years. And the facts are, we have evidence that the Romans attacked other cults occasionally. There's a very famous account of the cult of Bacchus, where the authorities suddenly started accusing the cult of Bacchus of conducting immoral practices. And something like, don't quote me on this, something like 700 Roman citizens, upstanding Roman citizens, were forced into some kind of slavery to punish them, not to mention the people who died. And when you read between the lines and you read the supporting text, you realize it had nothing to do with religion at all. The reason why they were oppressed was because there was a financial issue. The administrators in Rome didn't like the idea of a group independent of them dealing in monetary matters. And so it was actually a way of getting rid of people who were not, ensuring the supremacy and centralization of the administration. We have the same problem in the reign of Domitian. Domitian has a terrible track record. He was a horrific emperor. He killed a lot of people. He also killed Christians. He killed Jews. And when you find out why he killed people, the religion is not the reason. It's always politics. So you have to be a bit more circumspect before you just assume that Romans ran around for 400 years killing Christians. I don't buy that at all. It happened occasionally, and there were some periods under Diocletian where it was very intense. But it turns out these are normally politically motivated. Normally.
What do we know about Lucian of Samosata?
Who?
Lucian of Samosata.
You'll have to help me here. I'm maybe not hearing you correctly. Did you say?
I said Lucian of Samosata.
Don't know. I can't at this moment. I really can't even think who that is.
Yeah, you
Give me a
talk
bit of
about him.
background.
You talk about him
Yeah.
in the book.
Okay. You said
Let me
Sola
just.
Sola.
I think it might be actually in the first couple of pages.
Talk about Mara Balsapian.
No, it's Lucian.
Lucian of Samosata.
Yes.
Lucian. Oh, yes, Lucian. Sorry. Yeah, well, I mean, he's a famous rhetorician and satirist. His writings are, I mean, they're funny. They're satirical. He attacks a lot of things. And just in one of his writings, he attacked, what was his name now? I'm trying to think now. My brain's gone out of the window. He attacked a guy. I think his name was Peregrinus, and Peregrinus apparently he was a bit of a a bit of a teaser. He deliberately joined a Christian cult in the story, and what he did was he faked it with the Christians. He faked that he was converted, and then he started doing amazing things, miracles, and then, according to Lucian of Samosata, he said to him, he said that he was treated as a god. He actually says that, treated as a god by the Christians. Now that cannot be true. But then again, we must realize that Lucian is sending up the whole situation, that this man can fool the Christians because they're so dumb, they're so silly. They can be fooled by this fakery. And the reason why he wrote this is because he's trying to show people at that time what a ridiculous cult this is. And that's his opinion, of course. And he's using his satire to make them look stupid. And that's all there is to it. And again, because he talks about Christians in the 2nd century, conservative Christians who are desperately looking for some extra biblical support point to him and say, well, look, he's talking about Christians, so therefore Jesus existed. And again, they're missing the point. It doesn't help us because he doesn't say anything about Jesus himself. It's not evidence about Jesus himself, and it certainly tells us nothing about Jesus's life. So it's pointless. And what I'm saying to you now can be leveled at almost every single one of these so-called extra biblical sources. They're always accounts about what Christians are doing, not what Jesus was doing. And that should show you the level of desperation here, because if that's all you've got, and you read information from some of these faith-based sources, they constantly quote all of these letters and documents that we've been talking about as the evidence for Jesus' existence. And I'm saying, well, they're not. And even if Jesus existed, what does that tell you about Christianity? It doesn't help you understand Christianity any better. I think I use an example. Just trying to think now. There was a very early Greek philosopher. His name's gone out of my head right now. But anyway, this Greek philosopher, back in the 6th century, he believed that earthquakes were caused by the fact that the earth was floating on a body of water. I'm sure you've heard of this. And quite frankly, that's a really good explanation. It's the beginning of science. Somebody's trying to understand why there are earthquakes. So he comes forward with a hypothesis that it was Thales, wasn't it? It was Thales, yeah. He comes forward with a hypothesis that earthquakes are formed by the movement of earth over water. Now, if years later somebody says, I believe that earthquakes are produced by the land moving over a body of water, and this proves the existence of tharlays, I would say, I don't understand the point that you're making. I don't doubt that tharlays existed, but I do not believe that earthquakes are caused by land over water, because that's been disproven now. Our science is better. We have a better explanation. And that's what science does. It comes up with better and better explanations. Science never claims that it has the total truth. It just says we have the best explanation with the facts that we have now. And we can substantiate. We make a claim, we substantiate it with hard evidence until something better comes along. But in the case of Jesus, people are trying to say that the Gospels are true because Jesus existed. It doesn't make sense. Whether Jesus existed or not has got nothing to do with it, because the message surely is what you're interested in, the plot, the dogma. Now, if the dogma happens to be incorrect, which I would say it is, because I'm a scientist, it doesn't have anything to do with Jesus' existence. But for some reason, people seem to think that if they can prove Jesus existed, it proves that their belief is right. Doesn't make sense. And equally, you have a bunch of people who say, mythicists who run around saying Jesus didn't exist are only saying that because they're trying to disprove Christianity. And that's not what they're trying to do. They're saying Jesus didn't exist for other reasons. And that is, there's no evidence for it. It's just that perhaps they need to be a bit more circumspect, because, affirmation of a negative doesn't necessarily prove anything. We just don't know. Does that help?
Yes, it does. And to answer what you were saying, or I did hear about that before. Did Josephus claim that Emperor Vespasian is the Jewish Messiah?
He claims that he doesn't exactly say send smoke up his backside, all right, but I get the feeling that's what he did. Josephus, I believe the real Josephus was quite a narcissist. He probably believed that he had some kind of powers. He believed, as I said, that he believed absolutely implicitly in his abilities as a priest, and he was proud of his heritage and his nobility, and he believed that he was a prophet. And he believed he had some kind of divine inspiration. There's no doubt about that in his writings. It comes through all the time. You get this feeling that Josephus just knows that he's right. You can't argue with him. He's correct. And he makes some claims in his writings which are really far-fetched. I mean, the one is, he says he knew that Vespasian was going to become emperor. So he told him that, and that's why his life was saved, remember? I mean, Vespasian then made him a member of his family. He changed his name from, I think he was Matthias something or another. He became Josephus Titus Flavius, which is a Roman name, and he became a Roman citizen. He lived in Rome, and that was when he was given the opportunity to write his 4 books. And we know that he was hated by the Jewish people. He was seen as a traitor. There was obviously a lot of distrust of him by Romans as well, because they saw him as being favored by Vespasian. And when Vespasian died, Titus took over and obviously tolerated this man. But when Titus died, very young, Domitian took over, and that's when Josephus disappears. Around about 100, Josephus just disappears. There's no explanation of what happened to him. And I'm not saying this did happen, but it seems that Domitian wasn't good for him. He either died naturally at 60, or he was taken out. That's my feeling. It's just strange because in his books he gives the impression he's going to say more later, he's going to write more, and he never does. So he claims to have had this prophetic moment where he prophesies Vespasian's mastership of the known world, and that's what happens. He also makes a very interesting statement about just before he was captured by Vespasian, he finds himself in a hole in the ground of, I think it was Jaffa, the destroyed city. It's completely destroyed. It's collapsed around him. And the Romans are looking for survivors. And he was the general in charge of the Jewish army. And now he's sitting there underground with a bunch of escapees and fugitives. And they all decide to commit suicide rather than give themselves up to the Romans. And Josephus is forced to partake in this ritual that two people will draw lots and then one will kill the other one all the way down. And then right at the end, whoever's left has to commit suicide. That's the agreement. And what happens in the story is unbelievable. Josephus is the only one left standing after 40 people have been killed. And then he's discovered by Vespasian. It's just unbelievable. Because the only way that could have happened is if Josephus knew some trick to ensure that he always ended up being the person doing the killing and not being the victim. So you get these stories, and then he'll say that because of that, it proves that, he was chosen. And as I say, he also keeps mentioning that the Romans deserved to win because that was God's will. Because God was angry with the people who were basically blaspheming and fighting against each other and being unkind to each other and misleading the people with lies. He has nothing good to say about the Sicarii or the Zealots or anybody involved in the fight against Rome. He sees them all as responsible for the destruction of Judea, ultimately.
Many scholars will point to Pliny as a source of awareness of Christians in his time. What is the problem with this viewpoint?
Okay, Pliny, I think the letters, the letters, it's Epistola 10, 96, 97. 96 is the letter from Pliny to, who was it then? Trajan, was it? No, not Trajan. Who was it?
Yeah, it was to Trajan.
Yeah, and then 97 is Trajan's response. It's a very confusing letter because he starts off by saying something really weird. He's never come across Christians before. He doesn't know anything about them. Now, this is somebody who was like high up in government, had been an administrator all over the place, and now he's in Bithynia. And he suddenly got a problem. And he talks about Christians as though they're criminals. And yet when he describes what the Christians do, everything they do is the opposite of being a criminal. In fact, the Christians are portrayed as these really good people who have almost a self-regulatory system where they do not commit crimes, where they get up in the morning and they pray to their God called Christ. The word Jesus is not mentioned, by the way, in this text. So there is a slim possibility we're talking about another deity, but the fact that he refers to them as Christians, we have to accept that they were early Christians. We know the date was 111 CE, so it was early 2nd century. We know that there definitely were groups called Christians by then. But again, he talks about them being criminals. And then he says, what I normally do is, I bring them in and I give them a chance to recant. And then they think, but you've just told us you don't know who Christians are. And now you tell this is your normal policy. I mean, that's a contradiction. And I'm thinking if somebody interpolated that letter just to make it look like Christians were getting a bad time, they didn't do a very good job. And so I have to accept that it's probably more likely to be authentic than not, but it's still very strange. I mean, he tells us that he gets information out of the two deaconesses by torture. That's normal because torture was used in Rome and in the Middle Ages as the only genuine way you could trust the information. And then you realize he makes a statement about having got hold of some Roman citizens who were afflicted with this curse, this belief system. And then you realize that means everybody else has been talking about up until this time were not Romans. And what does he say about the Roman citizens? He says he sends them to Rome. Now you've got to do some math here. When you know how far Bethany and Pontus is from Rome. It's thousands of miles. Are you telling me that he really sent people thousands of miles to Rome to be tried because they were Christians? I just don't buy that. I find it so weird. But that's the text we have. And the response by Trajan is also fascinating because he basically says you're doing the right thing, but don't allow people to, tell tales about other people. We're civilized people. We don't do things like that. So yeah, the jury's out on that one. And again, let me say, if the letter is genuine, what does it tell us? It tells us about a bunch of Christians living in Bithynia in the early 2nd century. It tells us that they were very peace-loving, that they said prayers in the morning, and that for some reason they were guilty of some crime. And it doesn't make sense. There's another letter, just as an aside, where the issue of starting a fire brigade is mentioned. And Pliny says something similar in the fact that he's aware that it's now against the law to form groups. And it seems that this is something that Trajan started, that he doesn't want any groups of people to be created that have a similar agenda. He sees it as a threat for some reason. So even though they're going to be firefighters doing something useful, he's not happy about this. And then if I go back to Epistola 10:96, I'm thinking, is that the reason that these people are criminals? Because they're in a group that's doing something that's not normal, that's not Roman maybe. Because Pliny does say that he makes them pay abeyance to the bust of Trajan, and they also have to renounce Christianity. And if they say the prayers to the bust and they renounce Jesus, he lets them go. He doesn't even question it. So as I say, the jury's out. It's very interesting stuff.
What was the Roman attitude towards Jews and Christians?
According to what I've read, the Jews were mostly tolerated. As I said earlier, certainly in imperial times, when the empire started, they were tolerated because they said prayers for the emperor in the temple. And that seems to be one of the reasons why they were not victimized. There are a few accounts of Jews rioting in Rome and being exiled from Rome. We also know that it's possible that as much as 10% of Roman citizenry were adopting the Jewish faith. Don't forget, Judaism was a religion of conversion. It had nothing to do with genetics. It had to do with obeying Torah and accepting the restrictions that were implied, kashrut, dietary laws, being circumcised, and, as I say, obeying the mitzvot. It seems to have been quite popular, and I personally believe that because such a large portion of the Roman Empire was converting to Judaism at that time, that would have assisted Constantine's move to make Christianity the official religion. Because the reason why he did that in the first place is he could see that this religion was taking off, and it was very useful to him because he could use its infrastructure to help him govern the empire by using the bishops and their flocks. And there's no doubt that many of those early Christians, say from the 2nd century onwards, had been people who had converted to Judaism first and then took the next step. So largely, there are exceptions. I mentioned Domitian, for example. He has an account where he does very severe things to two of his retinue who have become Jews. And the popular story is that he treated them badly because they were Jewish. It turns out he treated them badly for other reasons, political reasons. So largely, I'd say Jews had a fairly tolerable time. All the accounts of Christian victimization, as I say, most of it comes from the church narrative, which is that martyrdom was welcome. So it's very difficult to judge what actually happened. All we can say is that Romans generally were very tolerant of other beliefs. The Romans had a state religion, like the Greeks, but they allowed people to have their own private religions. People could do whatever they liked in their own homes. Nobody judged them for that. As long as you were a good Roman and you did the Roman thing in public occasions, and the Romans were very religious people. I mean, they only went to war at the time of year when it was religiously appropriate to do so. All their games were religious. Everything had a religious purpose. They used to use the word superstitio to refer to things that were not, in other words, which were above that which stood above that which is acceptable. That's where the word superstition comes from. So they distinguished between things which were not allowed and things that were. Considering the fact that Christian belief didn't really differ that much from the mysteries of Mithras, and the mysteries of Mithras was extremely popular with the Roman army, I personally can't see why there would have been a problem, except again for the emperor cult. The emperor cult is the only thing I can think of that may have caused a big problem. But very devout, literal, fundamentalist Christian groups may have demanded that they do not pay obeisance to a marble sculpture because it's idolatry. And that may have got them into hot water because they were not perceived to be good Romans. Being a good Roman was very important. But having said that, the Romans also believed that all gods, all deities had to be respected. So the jury is still out on that one. I would say the bottom line for me is I think the stories of the martyrdom of the Christians has been exaggerated. There was victimization on occasion, but it didn't happen consistently for 300 or 400 years. I just don't buy that. And I certainly don't think Christians ran around welcoming martyrdom or queuing up to convert to become martyrs. So, in fact, what a lot of people forget is that when Christianity became the dominant religion, the state religion, with Constantine, he actually stopped people ultimately enjoying their own personal religions. There was a period of a few centuries where other religions still existed, coexisted, but they were looked upon very negatively. Ultimately, they were destroyed. They went underground. Their documents were burnt. Their buildings were destroyed. Their temples were smashed to the ground. The library of Alexandria, attached to Serapis, this is the Serapis library, was burnt to the ground. So if you think about what the Christians did to the other religions when they got into power, that's something worth thinking about, because that happened right across the empire. So Christianity was not at all tolerant of other people's faiths. I think the Roman system was a lot more adaptable. As long as you, in public circumstances, obeyed or paid lip service to the state religion, it was fine. What you did in private was your own business. A few exceptions to that.
And in my closing question, what do you make of the claim that Marabar Serapion is referring to Jesus?
Okay, well, if you read what conservative scholars say, they tell us that this guy is writing a letter to his son while he's in prison awaiting death, and he's telling his son how to be a good boy, and he's got the same name of his father, Marabar Serapion. And then he reminds him of a few things, and he refers to the Pythagoreans, and he refers to Socrates, and he refers to the Jews. Now, we don't know when the letter was written. It could have been written in the 1st century. It could have been written in the 3rd century. So there's a 300-year period in which it could have been written. Okay, that's the first problem. The second problem is the conservative scholars who want this to be a reference to Jesus say outright it refers to Jesus and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, or something like to that line. Well, if you read the letter, there's no mention of Jesus in it, and there's no mention of Jerusalem. So that's a lie, actually. It mentions something called the wise king. Why should you assume wise king refers to Jesus? It doesn't even begin to make sense. There are many examples in the Old Testament where there were kings of the Jewish people where people were sent away into exile. And if you now want Jesus to be the wise king, the story doesn't even begin to make sense. In fact, I'm going to quote here the juicy bit from the letter, because this is a part that's really interesting. For what benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? Okay, that did happen. And to be, again, generous, there seems to be a link between Socrates and Jesus in modern times, because often people see Socrates as a precursor to Jesus, in terms that he held the law to be so important that he refused exile. He was prepared to be killed because he believed the law was so important. And then he says, seeing that they received a retribution for its famine and pestilence, or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras. Well, that's bullshit. Pythagoras was never burnt on Samos. In fact, he died a peaceful death. And then it mentions all the Jews by the murder of their wise king. Now, the assumption is that the Jews murdered their wise king, but it doesn't say that. We don't know if it means that. I think it means that, but that doesn't mean it does mean that. The Jews by the murder of their wise king. Who murdered the wise king? The Jews? We don't know. Okay, but the people who want to see this as Jesus now assume, Jesus was shot by the Jews to be murdered. But then again, he wasn't murdered by the Jews, was he? I think the Romans did it. So there's a problem there. Okay. Then seeing that from that very time, their kingdom was driven away from them. So now here's the assumption made that when the Romans eventually renamed Judea and called it Palestina, Syria, Palestina, many Jews were exiled. That was the end of the Jewish homeland. So they're assuming that was Jesus, and that was then the exile. Now, maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. Okay. So now, let's be generous and say that Mara Bar Sapion knew something about Christianity. He knew something about Judaism, and he was poetically referring to Christians murdering their king, Jesus. It still doesn't help us, because yet again, somebody's talking about the followers of Jesus. They're not talking about Jesus himself, and they don't even mention his name, yet alone tell us anything about him that's useful. And we don't know when it was written. My assumption is it would have been written between the late 1st and 3rd century, purely because I know Christianity as a term wasn't popular until after the middle of the 1st century. And that's okay, it's a thumbsuck. We don't have enough information. Again, it's conservative scholars who want there to be evidence for Jesus' existence. And so they see a writing like this as evidence that Jesus lived. And again, it's irrelevant. Whether he lived or died or didn't live, it doesn't matter. Because the religion, the myth, the dogma, the Christology, all that stuff is invented. It's post the crucifixion. It's something that developed and adapted and borrowed from other religions. It's an evolving process. Right now, the church is evolving. I mean, we have a pope who's about to probably allow us to wear condoms soon. I mean, who knows? I mean, it's evolving. It's not a static thing. And yet, everybody worried about whether Jesus lived, as though if Jesus did live, everything they believe in must be automatically true. That's total nonsense. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Nicholas Allen.
It's been fun.
Yeah, let's definitely do this again sometime. And
you should. Maybe you should do the Jesus Fallacy book, because that's fun.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that after we get off the air. I want to remind everybody to go get his book, Christian Forgery in Jewish Antiquities, Josephus Interrupted. The link to purchase the book is in the History Valley Amazon affiliate link just below in the description of the video. And I'll see everybody later.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.